Hi everyone, Tony Howell here. In this video I'm going to be talking about how to get sharper images in landscape photography, both handheld, and then we're going to go in depth into using the tripod. Obviously when you're hand holding, the shutter speed is all important because you've got to have a fast enough shutter speed to avoid the dreaded camera shake, because camera shake is probably the worst thing to do to your images, because even AI can't cope with camera shake very well yet. It may be able to do so in the future, but for now, you choose a fast enough shutter speed. So on this lens at the moment, I'm shooting at 70 millimeters, so you need at least a 70th of a second ideally, even if you have got image stabilization on your camera. So with image stabilization, you may be able to get a 30th or a 60th, but I always like to go higher because I can't stand getting back to the office, looking at the images really close up on the screen and then figuring out that it was still shaking a bit. Because on a larger sensor camera like this is 60 megapixels, any kind of camera shake really shows up badly. It probably doesn't so much on your camera if it's an APS-C or a Micro Four Thirds. To be able to achieve a high enough shutter speed, you may have to put the ISO up. At the moment it's very bright, so I'm probably going to get 125th of a second easily, so that's enough to cover the camera shake problem. But if it's getting dark, you might go down to maybe a 15th of a second or something like that. And if you've got a 15th of a second, obviously you need to put the ISO up. At the moment I'm on ISO 100, which is what I normally shoot at. Doesn't mean you should, but that's what I normally shoot at because it's got the less noise. But if you have had a 15th of a second, you're probably going to risk camera shake with that. And so you want to put the ISO up. So if you put the ISO up from 100 to 200, that changes your shutter speed to a 30th. If you put it up to 400, that changes the 30th into a 60th, and so on. If you put ISO 800, changes your shutter speed to 125th. So don't be afraid to use ISO at higher ISOs, because noise reduction software is so good these days, and it'll get even better in the future. Now when you're shooting handheld, obviously you don't want to be doing this with your hands away from your body. Not a good idea. So I'd recommend snuggling your elbows into your body like this, gripping it fairly tight. Obviously use the viewfinder as well so it's closer to your body. And then keep your legs slightly apart. I guess it's about 5 to 1 or 10 to 2 position on your legs, and then focus, take a breath, hold the breath in and fire. It's that simple really. Now I do something slightly differently than maybe you're doing, which is I use back button focus. So I've assigned the focusing to this button here, which at the moment says AF on, so that when I touch the shutter button, I'm not actually refocusing when I take the shot. So I can focus, and then I don't have to think again about focusing, and then I just squeeze the shutter, and then I've got my shot. So you may be able to do that with your camera. I find it easier than doing it the other way. Okay, now what about using a tripod? Obviously you've got to get the legs as far apart as they go. If it's a very windy day, get your tripod down low so it's out of the wind, and cover the camera with your body like this, you know, with the wind hitting your back, so that you get less chance of getting camera shake. You want to obviously tighten everything up. I prefer using my camera without straps, because the straps will just flap around in the wind and that might move the camera a little bit. I use spikes on the bottom of my tripod rather than the rubber feet, although funnily enough rubber feet are more suitable for rocks like this, but I just couldn't be bothered to change them. But generally spikes are better for most other surfaces, especially grass, sand, that kind of thing, because you can really push the tripod down in and get it really firm. So back to the wind. Still keep the ISO up if you need to, because you want to achieve a fast enough shutter speed whatever the case. So I would happily use my ISO at 200 or 400, but I tend to keep it at 100 if there's not much wind around, just to prevent noise. If it's pretty windy and you can get away with it, Don't use a lens hood either, because it creates more wind resistance, which is like to push the camera a little tiny bit. So take the hood off if you can get away with it. And using a long lens, because you're obviously magnifying the scene much more, because you're zooming in closer to it, you need to be even more careful about the shutter speed. Even on a tripod, try and use a higher shutter speed if you can. When you're on a tripod, you should switch the image stabilization off. You'll notice that this camera has a rock bag underneath it. It's useful for putting things in like filters and lens caps. It's very easy to walk off and forget that they're in there. But yeah, if you can find rocks, you can just put them in there. And it's got a hook underneath, so I can hang my camera bag onto it and give it some extra weight to really push the tripod down if it's a strong wind. You might find your tripod has a hook underneath, and obviously you can hang your bag from that just to keep it really nice and firm. Another good thing to do, especially when it's windy like it is now, is to not use the shutter button unless you're doing a 2-second timer or a 5-second timer, so that you're not actually touching the camera, so you're less likely to give it any camera shake. Now, obviously you can use a cable release, which attaches somewhere there, and you can just press the shutter button that way, which is fine, but they tend to break so easily. So I've used my phone app before now to take photographs, and I find that quite easy because you can look at the screen and you don't even have to look at the camera. You can just press the shutter button on the app. I'll show you a clip of that from somewhere else. My cable release broke a while ago and I haven't got a replacement for it yet, and I hate the damn things anyway because they just break so quickly. So I can't use a 2-second timer because obviously I'm trying to get the waves at the peak of their movement. So I'm trying to get the wave crashes at their height. So I'm using this camera app, which is useful because I can turn the 2-second timer off. I don't know if you can see that, but anyway, so you can shoot remotely with this. So it's the only way I can do it really without actually touching the camera, and I don't really want to touch the camera because as soon as I do that with this soft grass that I'm on, I'll be pushing the camera down a little bit, and that will give me some slight blurring in the image, so I don't want that. So I'm not touching the camera, and I'm also shielding the camera and the tripod from the wind with my body. Oh, that's a good one. Oh yes, liking that. Great, got a shot already. Fantastic. Oh, if it's the only one I get today, then that's a job well done. Brilliant. Right, now how to compose this shot is fairly simple. I think I want to put the rock, which is called Gull Rock, on the third line, so it's 2/3 over from the left. I think I want roughly about 1/3 sea and more sky, because the sky is pretty nice. So I think something like that will be my composition. So we've talked about hand holding, we've talked about tripod use, but obviously there's another factor which is very important for getting sharp images, and that is depth of field. Now, depth of field, as you can see now, the camera is focused on me and the rocks behind me are blurry. I mean, that's intentional obviously, but that's because I'm using an aperture of f6.3. So if I'd used a smaller aperture which has the larger number, like f16, there'd be more of this rock behind me in focus. So aperture determines how much of your image is in focus. So with a large aperture, which has a small number, like f2.8, you'd have about that much of your image in focus, depending on the focal length of the lens. f5.6, f8, f11, and then you might get f22. F22 might give you the entire image in focus if you're using a wide enough lens. The more telephoto the lens is, the more you've zoomed in, the less depth of field you're going to get. I know I'm always saying it, but you should revisit places often, because I didn't even know this shot was possible. So this was taken from several miles away, so as you can imagine it's got quite a lot of haze in it, and this is Wheelcoats with some people walking their dogs. So this was taken from Porth Town, so it's at least 2 miles away, maybe 3, and it was taken with a 600mm focal length, and I achieved that by using my 400mm lens in APS-C mode. So I'm really pleased with this, because it's not a great image, but it shows me that this image is possible, and I can always go back and take it again with hopefully even more dramatic light. Now, the other thing you should do with all of your lenses is test them at different apertures with different focal lengths. So for example, this lens I'm videoing on now is a 20 to 70mm. So really you should check it at 20mm using f4, f8, f16, then at 50mm, f4, f8, f16, and then at 70mm, f4, f8, f16. So those are 3 points. So you've got f4, which is a large aperture, f8, which is a medium aperture, and f16, which is a small aperture. Now you should find that things will be sharper at f4 and at f8 than they would be at f16, because with f16 you get diffraction caused by light bouncing around inside the lens because of such a tiny aperture. So you'll probably find f16, although it's useful in some circumstances, is just a bit too soft for most uses, so that's why I tend to stay away from it. But I'm not saying don't ever use it, because there are times when you might need it. I tend to shoot at f8 because it's a good average aperture, the image quality is good. It tends to be the sweet point of most lenses, although f8 or f5.6 might be the sweet point of your lens. You have to find out. Also, the place to do this really is ideally somewhere in woods, so that you've got all 4 corners of the frame have trees in them, or like a rocky background like this, and shoot so that you can see all detail in the corners of the frame. Obviously it's no good if you've got sky in the top of the frame, because you won't be able to see, you know, how good the detail is at the top, because the sky looks the same whether it's at f4 or f16. Another great way of getting sharp images is if you focus on the foreground for one shot and you focus on the background for another shot, or you might take 3 different shots focused in different places in a landscape, and then you stack these images together. It's called focus stacking, and I've done another tutorial on this